You're not afraid of the dark, are you?
My God, it's full of stars.
Quite an experience to live in fear, isn't it?
You have to consider the possibility that God does not like you. He never wanted you. In all probability, he hates you. It's not the worst thing that can happen.
It isn't.
There is a greater darkness than the one we fight. It is the darkness of the soul that has lost its way. The war we fight is not against powers and principalities. It is against chaos and despair. Greater than the death of flesh is the death of hope. The death of dreams. Against this peril we can never surrender. The future is all around us, waiting in moments of transition to be born in moments of revelation. No one knows the shape of that future or where it will take us. We know only that it is always born in pain.
Happy heresies, my beloved truth seekers. This is obviously Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis, broadcast from the virtual Alexandria and formerly through Free Thought Media. And this is all evident, or you wouldn't have clicked the music icon and entered a place where blasphemy shouldn't be this much fun.
I'm so afraid of how powerful this is.
It's not just a place where angels fear to tread, but the gods themselves, because we have exposed them for what they are. Spiritually castrated, petty like cosmic beggars, and constrained by the same space and time that has caused us headaches for lifetimes. And these gods and these angels crave what we have, that splinter of light substance within us that is older than creation, purer than the love of a mother, untainted like the Vestal Virgin, and precious enough to illume the heavens with yearning. This is our divine spark, our true selves, the only perfection we'll ever experience.
But where is it written that all our dreams must be small ones?
Like the Gospel of Thomas says, when you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father. But if you do not know yourselves, then you live in poverty, and you are poverty.
There is no price for individuality.
We have also exposed reality for what it really is, a slow-moving nightmare we must awaken from in order to release that divine spark from the muck of mere existence and return to our home of homes, that dream we call the pleroma.
Quite an experience to live in fear, isn't it? That's what it is to be a slave.
As one poet once said, I alone and afraid in a world I did not make. Yes, this is Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis, and I am your psychopomp for the next hour or so. In my mortal incarnation, you may call me Miguel Connor, but in reality, in a true reality, I am Abraxas, the God above God. If heaven, hell, creation, all that is and all that isn't had a form, it would be called Abraxas. And both Abraxas and Miguel are so grateful you have emanated yourself on this August 11th, 2007, or the whereabouts, and are ready to set the controls for the heart of the sun.
You always got to follow the truth, even if it brings a whole damn thing crashing down around you.
We are the Gnostics, the knowers in English, those who have taken the road of delirium into the heart of darkness in order to take a peek at the transcendental event horizon that is direct experience with the divine.
So my father once said to me, you don't choose the things you believe in, they choose you.
No more blind faith, no more material hard-ons, no more guilt for having been born. Just the self-knowledge of our divinity and unification of all that has been splintered inside of us by the mallets of the powers and principalities that rule the cosmos.
God is a mean kid sitting on an anthill with a magnifying glass, and I'm the ant. He could fix my life in 5 minutes if he wanted to, but he'd rather burn off my feelers and watch me squirm!
And if that doesn't suit you, turn off the show. Puke out the red pill you took when you thought you had enough huevos to dance with the devil, and go back to your sultry harem of denial. Money for nothing and your chicks for free.
How shall we fuck off, oh Lord?
Today, or more like in the Astral now, the topic is perhaps the greatest heretic to have wandered the Western continent. His name is Marcion of Sinope. To help us with this seismic magnitude of this blasphemer of the highest order, who may or may not have been a Gnostic, we are joined by my favorite Bible scholar, Robert M. Price. He is the author of Deconstructing Jesus, the incredibly shrinking Son of Man, the Pre-Nicene Bible, and a slew of other invigorating books that will turn all of your Christian views upside down.
I'm gonna need so much therapy after this!
Price is as radical as he is sapient, just as willing to take scholarly risks as he is ready to renew traditional theologies. He is definitely an encyclopedia of all things biblical and all things of ancient Christianity.
Whoa.
Not only do I urge you to purchase or borrow his books, but listen to his show, The Bible Geek, every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern. You can hear the program, peruse his book selection, and read a lot of horror show articles at his website, robertprice.mindvendor.com. Again, that is robertprice.mindvendor.com. A good place to lose your mind and come to your senses. Robert Price, who loves to call this show Coffee, Coffin Nails, and Gnosis, probably doesn't smoke, but will certainly give us the alpha and omega about Marcion.
I'm the saint of blasphemy.
I'll do my best against the gales of time allotted. But one thing is for sure is that you'll see even more how orthodoxy co-opted, corrupted, and whitewashed the teachings of the first and true Christians, the Gnostics. It is probably the greatest cover-up in history, since George Bush made it seem that it was God who destroyed the Tower of Babel and not an inside job.
You're working too hard. You're seeing conspiracies that don't exist. Yeah? Or maybe just getting too close for comfort.
Marcion of Sinope is perhaps the first Christian logician. Although being a Paul fanatic, and this perhaps because he wrote the original epistles themselves, Marcion was gifted with the common sense of a child. That doesn't sound all that great, but let me expand. As children, sitting restlessly doing religious or Sunday classes, wishing we were somewhere else like watering our youthful imaginations, most of us wondered if the God of the Old Testament and the Father of Jesus could be the same person. Don't tell me this didn't cross your mind. After all, one was a God who, despite his fatherly protective shadow, was prone to jealousy, vengeance, pride, and plenty of carnage.
We will not live by your commandments. We're free. There is no freedom without the law.
The other was an extension of the Christ that, although translated in a Jewish milieu, was a benign being who promised a gentle life for the most part, and even more in the Gnostic Gospel.
I give you the Buddy Christ.
Marcion was the first to notice the discrepancy and made it a linchpin to his theology. He just couldn't reconcile Jehovah with the Father of the Christ. One was the just God of Judaism, the other was the unknown Father of the Gnostics. He additionally couldn't see a strong enough strand between the Old Testament and the embryonic works of early Christianity. And like many Gnostics, he realized that this world belonged to the demiurge and his metaphysical Taliban, that there was something better beyond the shorelines of reality.
There must be some kind of way out of here.
He also decided that Christianity needed its own organized set of scriptures, a canon if you will, and Marcion didn't waste any time putting one together, which consequently got him thrown out of the Church of Rome. Yet with a growing following called the Marcionites, the budding Catholic Church had no choice but to react by commencing the work of their own Bible to counterattack Marcion. Imagine the creation of the Death Star, except with corrupted and redacted messages as a surface. And when this Death Star was completed, began the eradication of Marcion and anything Gnostic, a censorship that took centuries and was guarded for even more centuries, but we are uncovering in our Gnostic Renaissance.
From the dawn of time we came, moving silently down through the centuries, living many secret lives, struggling to reach the time of the gathering, when the few who remain will battle to the last. No one has ever known we were among you, until now.
Here is a quote that defines Marcion's keen sense of reason. When Jesus descended into hell, the sinners listened to his words and were all saved. But the saints, believing as usual that they were being put to the test, rejected his words, and were all damned. Pretty astute, eh? Could have easily been written by a theologian with a penchant for satire in the 21st century. And here's another quote showing the alien god of Marcion telling his son specific instructions. Go down, take on thee the form of a servant, and make thyself like the sons of the law. Heal their wounds, give sight to the blind, bring their dead to life, perform without rewards the greatest miracles of healing. Then will the God of the law be jealous and instigate his servants to crucify thee. Then go down to hell, which open her mouth to receive thee, supposing thee to be one of the dead. Then liberate the captive thou shalt find there, and bring them up to me.
We are God's unwanted children? So be it!
So Marcion's Jesus is a very Gnostic one, not a savior per se, but a liberator, an infiltrator of this world of forms that advises us how to execute the greatest of prison breaks. The Jewish clothing is just that, clothing, although the message, the mystery of spiritual liberty, is universal. But I better not talk more about Marcion. Robert Price does a much better job. I've simply warmed you up to enjoy the great heretic. But as you listen to the interview, imagine that in the background you can hear the church fathers scream with the voice of Jan in the Brady Bunch. Marcion, Marcion, Marcion.
Could he be any more pathetic? I think it's sweet.
Anywho, I would like to set the record straight on one subject, though, before we go more down the road of heresy. I usually use the word orthodoxy to explain our spiritual adversaries here at Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis. As someone mentioned the other day, orthodoxy does mean right thinking, and I think he was right in thinking that. In a strange sense, the Gnostic revival has made us the orthodox, the right thinkers. After all, the Gnostics are as reason-based as they are mystic. So when I use the word orthodoxy, I'm using the context of what Timothy Freke and Peter Gandy called literalists. Those who take the base meaning of anything religious they read and then try to impose it on others. Like St. Paul said, the letter killeth, the spirit giveth life. I will continue to use the word orthodoxy, my beloved truth seekers, but it's the same as literalists. I also use the term fundagelicals when it suits me.
Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition.
But the reality, again going back to Freke and Gandy, is that we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Every religion, every faith, every ideology has a benign, introspective, and esoteric side. There are even gems grafted like barnacles of light on a hole on the harshest of orthodox surfaces. I am as grateful to the Roman Church for Teresa de Avila, the Eucharist, Notre Dame, for example, as I am resentful to it for destroying the Library of Alexandria and putting man back 1,000 years.
I want everyone to remember why they need us.
I am a firm initiate of what Stephen Haller calls qualified dualism, which is understanding that light and darkness are mixed in this universe. It's not black and white, but a foggy gray that we must separate to its rightful origins without too much judgment. Like the Gnostic master Basilides said, evil adheres to created existence as rust adheres to iron.
Ernest Hemingway once wrote, "The world is a fine place and worth fighting for." I agree with the second part.
And in the end, as Tobias Churton told me once, and the Frankian Kabbalists believed, once you've experienced enough Gnosis, Satori in Japanese, Marifa in Sufism, Enlightenment in Buddhism, you'll have to take a voyage right back through orthodoxy. You'll have to understand, sympathize, empathize, and reconcile with all that once scarred you.
What we do in life echoes in eternity.
You'll have to see it as another aspect of you that needs to be separated, embraced, and ultimately balanced so that you may become a balanced creature. For once you are balanced, as all Gnostic texts point out to, you will fully allow the energy of the pleroma pass through you and realize that all is one and one is all. Distinction will fade away like the tears of those who oppress you for so long in the catacombs of your memories.
All my life, I've had doubts about who I am, where I belonged. Now, I'm like the arrow that springs from the bow. No hesitation, no doubts. The path is clear.
It's as simple as that and as complicated as all the rest. But enough of my drivel. You know what orthodoxy is. Let us get into the mind of the heretical, blasphemous Marcion and learn a little more about our own heretical, blasphemous thirsts. This is the Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis interview, or like our guest today likes to call it, Coffee, Coffin Nails, and Gnosis. And our guest today is the great Robert Price. How you doing, Bob?
Oh, not so great, but fine.
Well, thanks for taking your time today, and talk a little bit about the great heretic Marcion. Could you give us a quick A&E biography of Marcion?
Well, there's a big debate over when exactly he lived. It's usually been thought that he was active around 140, I guess, at the height of his powers, in close to the mid-2nd century A.D., and though that still probably stands, there's been a wave of revisionist thinking. For example, R. Joseph Hoffman arguing that since the anti-heresy forces always liked to late date the so-called heretics to make them latter-day lunatics that didn't have to be taken seriously, that there is some evidence that Marcion's followers thought that he had lived, that he was active already at around 100 A.D., and there's even one astonishing tradition that he worked as a scribe or editor for the author of the Fourth Gospel. So, I mean, that's one of those weird traditions that you sort of have to take seriously. I think it comes from a so-called Orthodox source, even. So he may have been almost an apostolic figure. Then he was from Sinope in Pontus in Asia Minor, which would be in today's Turkey. Sinope was also the homeland of the great Cynic founder Diogenes centuries before, who, like Marcion, was an ascetic. Marcion, whose name just means mark the less, or marquis, Mark being the most common male name in the Roman Empire. He was the son of wealthy parents and perhaps inherited a shipbuilding business. And so that must have helped, just like Mitt Romney and other presidential candidates with a big bank account to draw on, to promote his teaching. And eventually he is said to have gone to Rome to set forth the doctrine he preached there and to make a huge contribution to the Roman Church, but they decided that what he preached was heresy and gave him the money back. While he was there, I guess, or some point, he had an encounter with Polycarp of Smyrna, one of the great Orthodox bishops in the early 2nd century, and he said, "Do you recognize me?" which apparently had to do with the church politics of the situation. And Polycarp then said, "Oh yeah, I recognize you. I know the firstborn son of Satan when I see him." And thereby hangs a great, great tale, because Marcion, who believed that there were two gods in the Bible, the Jewish scriptures revealed by the creator God, the Hebrew God, then the hitherto unknown alien God of compassion and love who sent his son Jesus into the world. There are these two gods, very much as people say today, that, oh, God sure seems like a nasty guy in the Old Testament, but lightens up in the New. Well, Marcion saw the same and even wrote a book about that, showing the differences. But he said that must mean there are two deities. And Jesus, what was Jesus preaching when he says, no one knows the Father but the Son, unless it was a new God? And what was this stuff about that Paul says about believers being adopted as sons of God? Weren't they already sons of the Creator? Well, yeah, they were. Now they're switching to a new God, thanks to Jesus. And Christianity in the 2nd century was fluid enough that it was possible that Rome could have accepted this. They wound up deciding not to, but it wasn't like, you open the door and it's a Jehovah's Witness, sorry buddy, slam. There was the possibility that it would be taken seriously, and then it was by others, and Marcion overnight had a huge denomination all over the Roman Empire and beyond it that was so popular, especially in its maneuver to create a new Christian scripture and stop co-opting and misinterpreting the Old Testament, which belonged to Judaism, that the bishops of the emerging Catholic Church decided they had to follow suit, like the morning after Sputnik was launched. And they said, okay, we're going to keep the Jewish Bible and interpret it in a Christian way, but this guy doesn't have a bad idea, but suppose we take his scripture, the letters of that heretic apostle Paul, and sanitize them by adding some stuff, including 3 new epistles from a Catholic standpoint. And he has a gospel, let's pad that out, we'll call it Luke. He only likes Paul, let's create an Acts of all the apostles and make them as good as Paul. Let's add some more gospels, let's scrape up some more epistles by some more apostles. And it looks like the guy that did this and gave the New Testament our canonical shape was Polycarp. But it was all a reaction to Marcion. Then Marcionite Christianity lasted a long time and was finally stamped out under Constantine, though it continued to survive beyond the borders of the empire for a while. And in fact, I think it's quite important that the Tertullian says that Marcion discovered the epistle to the Galatians, which usually implies something like Huldah and Hilkiah discovering Deuteronomy, or Joseph Smith discovering the Book of Mormon, that he may have written some version of Galatians and had a truer text of the rest of the stuff, but it appears Marcionites and Gnostics are the first actual Pauline Christians we know of. I tend to think, and I'm writing a book about this now, where I suggest that there was no Paulinism in the first century, and that it really is a kind of Gnosticism and Marcionism that blossoms in the second. So he's just incredibly important as the first inventor of the notion of the New Testament, and even an author, perhaps, of Galatians and Ephesians, and maybe even part of Romans. So just an enormously important figure, much more important than the so-called 12, for instance, of whom we know nothing. It's kind of interesting who history tells us about and who it doesn't, and I'm telling you too much about him now.
Marcion wasn't really a theologian or a philosopher. He was just a logician. That was his strength.
Yes, the way Harnack, in one of the absolute great books on Marcion, puts it, he was a biblical theologian. He didn't approach it, as you say, from a philosophical standpoint. I mean, there's a bit of that, because at the basis of the whole thing is, how can there be such evil in a world created by a good God if he is? I mean, that's hanging around, but it's in the Bible too. He was just trying to address the question, how come the Jewish Bible speaks of a Jewish Messiah, but not Jesus Christ? How come Jesus seems to be revealing a new God and a loving God? Let me take that literally. Well, then I've got one religion, Judaism, which is true in its own right, and another one, Christianity, which Jesus founded, and that's the one I want to belong to. So he was simply saying, let's look. He's very much like the early Unitarians. They were just saying, I don't think received orthodoxy is really biblical enough. What would it be like if we'd had a truly biblical theology? And I think that's what Marcion was doing.
Yeah, and by the same logic, didn't he believe that the 12 apostles simply had dropped the ball and Paul was the one who got it, as you may say?
Yeah, he said that Jesus came with this big new revelation, and that but he came to fellow Jews. And it was just too much for him. They didn't understand that he really wanted something new. And that sounds at first like a kind of kooky sectarian claim, like the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons say, centuries later we got the original idea. But look at the Gospels, especially Mark. Isn't that exactly the idea you get, that the carefully chosen disciples of Jesus are utter ninnies that fail to understand Jesus at every point? And then there's that lone wolf exorcist thing in Mark, this mysterious thing where John says to Jesus, Master, you'll be glad to know that we saw this guy working our side of the street, casting out demons in your name, and we told him to cease and desist since he wasn't with us. And Jesus says, you did what? Look, the guy's casting out demons in my name. He's no enemy. We need all the friends we can get. Well, who's that likely to be? What's that about? It just seems to me that's we're talking about at least non-12 Christianity. More than likely, we're talking about Paul, and so Mark is written from that standpoint, and the gospel writers that do like the 12 are obviously reacting to Pauline Christianity, like Matthew. He has Paul, I think, as the one who is going to be least in the kingdom of heaven because he teaches others not to keep the Torah. He's going to be the guy left holding the bag saying, but Lord, don't you remember the good old days when I did miracles in your name? Get out of here. I never knew you. And he omits the lone wolf passage, the exorcist thing. And Matthew is Judaizing, right? He's got Jesus as the new Moses with the 5 books of a new Torah and all that. Or Luke, the Catholicizing gospel. He undoes most of that stuff about the 12. It seems exactly like Marcion said. You only have an appreciation of these cipher apostles, who really no more than names, in later Judaizing or Catholicizing gospels, which are the same, really. And so it seems to me his claim was not far-fetched at all, and that often he's got the real meaning of some of the Pauline passages that just read very strangely on a Catholic paradigm. God of this world blinds the readers of the Torah. What is that? Is he calling Satan God? I guess he could, but that sounds like Marcionism, the God of this world, as opposed to the Father of Jesus Christ. So I think old Marcion was an amazingly astute reader of the Bible.
And so he came back, or he presented the Luke to Rome. So that makes would that make Luke the earliest gospel?
I've never been too sure of that. I've read some stuff about whether Marcion's gospel was a synoptic gospel, and if so, was it an earlier version of Luke? Because John and Mark both have so much Marcionite or Marcion-friendly content that I think there was, I'm not sure which gospel. We know the church fathers thought Marcion had a shorter version of Luke, but I'm really beginning to wonder if he had a gospel at all, or if this is one of these many cases where they just attribute to the founder anything any of his successors said. We have a lot of trouble with both specific text readings and beliefs, trying to separate the historical Marcion from what his followers said. And I have a sneaking hunch he did not have a story of Jesus at all. It was more like Basilides or one of these people that just had a kind of a Jesus Savior myth.
J.R.S. Meads said that Marcion's Gospel of Christ was actually not the Luke, but a group of Jesus sayings. What do you think of this, Bob?
Well, that's going in the same direction. That guy, Mead, is totally brilliant. Anything he says must be taken seriously, no matter how far out it sounds. I doubt that even. I think that I find it so impressive that the Dutch radical hypothesis or reading of the epistles that say that you just would not have this kind of stuff if the writer had access to anything like the gospel Jesus tradition, including something like Q. So it seems to me that these Marcionites and Gnostics that I think wrote the Pauline epistles, when they say I have a command of the Lord, they mean some sort of a prophecy. So I'm really moving to the view that that the very idea of a gospel. Keep in mind that the gospel stories look so much like Old Testament stories, they appear to have been rewritten from the Septuagint. So they originally start Moses or David or Elijah or Elisha. Now the story's shuffled around. It's about Jesus. To have gospels like that is already a counter-Marcionite move. It's trying to historicize and Old Testamentize Jesus, and to save the Old Testament by actually rewriting it, not merely reinterpreting it. So I think I think Marcion really did not have a gospel. He just had the apostolicon, the letters. I know that's a kind of a new and wacky theory, but that's what I think currently.
And who do you think wrote the pastorals to counter Marcion?
I think 2 Timothy and Titus were written by Polycarp, which is an old theory, by the way. I think von Kampenhausen and others have suggested that. There's a lot of vocabulary and ecclesiology in common. And that then as Schleiermacher said, somebody later wrote the so-called 1 Timothy as a kind of a digest of those two, and so it was then naturally associated with them. But the first two, I think, are Polycarp's, as is the Book of Acts, and whatever is in Luke that was not in the Ur Lucas that Marcionites had. So I think Polycarp is a major New Testament writer. That would sure explain things, like why the Lucan writings are dedicated to Theophilus. Well, who's that? Well, it might just be his colleague and buddy, Theophilus of Antioch, which is an old theory, too, though you don't hear it much.
Yeah, and don't you have also the theory I heard in the Bible Geek that Basilides might have written Mark and Polycarp got his hands on that, too?
Yeah, because anyway you cut, now that, the argument I was referring to there, which I do take seriously but am not as convinced of, is proposed by my friend Stefan Hermann Huller, who argues that Secret Mark was a genuine ancient document and was the original Mark, and that it had been sanitized somewhere along the line. We know Polycarp met with Marcelina, I think her name was, in Rome, who was a North African Gnostic, and Hermann argues that the Salome business in Secret Mark so closely reflects that in the so-called Gospel according to the Egyptians, and of which Basilides is sometimes made the author, that would make Basilides the author of Mark's Gospel, period. And I realize that's connecting the dots speculatively, and so I'm not convinced of it, but I find it plausible. But that would mean that just like in the case of Luke and John, you have originally, well, really Matthew too, since Matthew was a rewrite of Mark, you have counter-Marcionite rewrites of the Gospels by the New Testament editor, who felt desperate to counter the Marcionite Gospel. And so Mark becomes shorter Mark, if you accept Secret Mark. I'm not sure I do. But you also have it Catholicized by making it into the Gospel of Matthew. And as Bultmann pointed out, you had a Gnostic John, which some Christians, Catholics, thought was written by Cerinthus. Maybe it was. And that the ecclesiastical redactor added to that sacramental and eschatological materials and so on. Well, who would that have been? In the context, it seems to me that's probably our buddy Polycarp, too. He's a real good candidate.
Yeah, and he's a very busy candidate, isn't he?
Yeah, he was supposed to be famous for something. I mean, he was one of like Ignatius and Irenaeus and these people. He was supposed to be a big deal for some reason other than just getting killed in the end.
Wasn't he didn't he say he was the apostle or the disciple of John?
Yeah, and I don't think he says it, because there's so little that admittedly comes from his pen. The letter of Polycarp and the Apostolic Fathers, which just sounds like fragments of Pauline epistles, especially the Pastorals. There's not much to it. And to solve some internal contradictions, Harrison argued that there were two very brief epistles of Polycarp put together there, but he doesn't mention anything about John. I believe Irenaeus does, and he makes Polycarp and Papias both disciples of John, and then Eusebius says, well, that's not true, and he distinguishes between the elder John and the apostle John. But Eusebius probably was just doing that because he had come not to like the book of Revelation, which says it was written by some John. And so Eusebius may have driven a wedge between John, son of Zebedee, and John the elder. That's what motivated it anyway. So he denies that at least Papias was a hearer of John. I think he thought Polycarp was, though. Well, he does say that. But then again, we don't know how seriously to take that, because Irenaeus was he would trace any kind of hadith back to the elders and apostles. I mean, they include, how should a good Christian brush his teeth? Well, he should do the top first and then the bottom, because that's what the elders said. What? We should observe Easter on this day, not that one, because that's what the elders said. Jesus lived to be 50 years old, as all the elders in the East say. You see this so often, you realize that you can't take it seriously. So we don't really know who he was in touch with, or who John, son of Zebedee, would have been. He occurs in one Jewish medical text that has Qumran affinities as a famous Jewish physician with no Christian connection. John Bar Zebediah. Has he been borrowed by the early Christians? I mean, he's a cipher wherever he appears, as they all are. So, who knows what it means that they might have had. I go along with Eisenman that all of the so-called 12 are garbled doublings of the pillars, the 3 or 4 brothers of the Lord, so-called. That makes a lot more sense to me, and so that John, son of Zebedee, John the Baptist, and others are originally all the same guy.
Well, going into Marcionite theology, what separates Marcion from the Gnostics, at least the main point, is that he believed that only faith saves, right?
Yes, the faith in the offer of adoption from the Father of Jesus. And this was something anybody could know and should know. It wasn't kept back for the elite. There was kind of an elite. If you wanted to go all the way, you could be baptized and then swear off sex and probably eating meat and all of that. He had a kind of a big church made of catechumens with a minority who had actually been baptized, but then so did the Catholics. But that was the rite of passage. I think Esnik, this Armenian church father, tells us there was a secret side to Marcionism. Generally speaking, we don't get that impression. There might have been, but it wasn't the idea that Jesus, Father, was not the creator, as with Gnosticism. He trumpeted that. So it was faith, not knowledge. And the death of Jesus also was central for him. Jesus had a kind of a celestial body. He wasn't strictly a Docetist, like where you would say Jesus was something like a hologram, but rather that I think it was more like Caspar Schwenkfeld during the Reformation, that the body of Jesus was made of heavenly substance, so he could and did suffer on the cross to ransom the human race from its creator. And I think that's mighty interesting, that's what the only sense redemption would really make. Otherwise, who's he paying to? What's he paying to whom? To the devil? To his own father? What? Well, it kind of makes sense if you say he was like manumitting the slaves of the Creator and freeing them up for adoption by the Father. And so it was important to him, whereas some Gnostics could only go so far as Valentinus did, to make the death of Jesus a grade B salvation scheme for the non-elite. That's another big difference between Marcion and the Gnostics.
Yeah, and also, didn't he believe, unlike the Gnostics, that we didn't have a divine spark, but we were completely the creatures of the Creator God?
That's
like
right,
the
yeah.
Manichaeans?
As Tillich would say, Marcion believed in the conciliation of strangers, not the reconciliation of the estranged. In Gnosticism, you are part of the Godhead, but alienated, and so you have to be reconciled by recollection, like Platonism. But in Marcion's view, no. God is alien to us, not alienated, and that's why we can only be adopted as his sons and daughters. So I think Harnack is right. Marcion wasn't a Gnostic, and this is the small element of truth in the argument of Karen King and others that there's no such thing as Gnosticism. I think that's as ludicrous as arguing that there was no such thing as Buddhism or Presbyterianism. But the one element of truth is it's too easy to use Gnosticism as a catch-all for so-called heresies. And that's what's happening when Marcionism is made into Gnosticism. And who knows, maybe the historical Paul was a bit of both, because I think Paul was actually Simon Magus, and of whom we have a couple of extra biblical notices. And that he did teach salvation by grace, the law as the creation of angels, and he had a bit of both from what we know about him.
Although most people think of Marcion as believing in the two gods, the alien God and the just God of the Jews, Iano Culiano in the Tree of Gnosis mentions that he actually believed in up to 9 gods or principles.
I've read that. I don't remember now what his argument was. There were various Marcionites who began to multiply the different principles. So some believed in 2 or 3. Apelles apparently re-simplified the thing afterward. I don't know where he gets that. I'll have to reread that.
Yeah, I think, he believed in the just God, but he also believed in Satan. He believed in the Jewish Messiah, but that would only help Israel and Christ. And
oh yeah, that's true. Yeah,
mm-hmm.
Yeah. He I don't think he would have made those into parts of the Godhead, but that's right. Yeah, the Jewish Messiah is going to come. It's just as Jews say, he has not yet come, and as Jews say, Jesus was not he. And I think that figures into the origin of the Christian notion of the Antichrist. That what Christians wound up believing was the Jewish Messiah is going to come, all right, and it's not Jesus, it's the Antichrist. And that's kind of, Marcion lays the groundwork for that. I get into that in a little bit in my book that's supposed to come out a couple of months from Prometheus, the paperback Apocalypse. But he certainly believed in other stuff, but Satan wouldn't be the God of this age. That would just be the Hebrew law-giving God.
So bottom line, you don't think Marcion is actually Gnostic, maybe just a close cousin, perhaps, or just part of the same fountainhead?
Just the next option over, just as you had, like Clement of Alexandria was probably more Gnostic than Marcion was, in the sense of knowledge being more important than faith. There was a whole range of ideas, or like the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles. They tend to be docetic in their Christology, and also very ascetic and encretite. But they're not all Gnostics. There's some Gnostic liturgical material in the Acts of John and the Acts of Thomas, but that's just popular Christianity that has some of the elements of Gnosticism, probably without actually being Valentinian or Basilidean or any of those. And in the same way, Marcion shares some elements with Gnosticism. But there's just a huge mix of things. Like adoptionism pops up in all sorts of different places. It's not a distinct type of Christianity in its own right, though. And so there are all these emphases, and it depends on which combination you find them in and how many of them are there before a particular thinker or movement would qualify. And even then, they're just ideal types. Someone could just play the semantics game differently and say Marcion does belong with the Gnostics, but naturally he's got his own distinctives. For instance, open teaching about the two gods, and rather than esotericism. Well, as long as someone nuanced it that way, I wouldn't have any trouble with it. But early Christianity just seems to have been a real melting pot of things.
What do you think of the idea that the Nicene Creed was partly written to counter the Marcionites?
Well, from what I know, it makes more sense to suggest that the Apostles' Creed was, because of the emphasis on the Creator. It's already there in the Apostles' Creed, and as with all these creeds, something's not going to be stipulated there unless you're trying to settle a dispute. And ordinarily, you would think, well, who's going to dispute that God is the creator of the world? Well, Marcion would. Okay, well, we better address that. Whereas the Nicene Creed's just got Arianism and Athanasianism written all over it. God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not created. Like, that's all got Arius in the gun sights. Whereas I think they figure, well, Marcion, that's stale news. But I do think he's in view in the Apostles' Creed.
And I mean, Marcion was definitely, and the Marcionites was definitely a threat to the church. Wasn't the one church father said that Marcionites were as common as the stars?
Yeah, that they're all over the place, and that's why they couldn't just ignore them as they did some of the others. You almost get the impression that these handbooks against the heretics by Epiphanius and Hippolytus and Irenaeus are just antiquarian things. Now here's an odd group. How about the Fibionites? Bet you never heard of it. But with this, oh no, you got people writing these polemical treatises because he's too much of a danger. Justin, Tertullian, and all these guys. And he apparently rivaled the Catholic Church, if not outnumbered them. He was the first kind of Christianity in Edessa, as Walter Bauer pointed out. The Chronicle of Edessa tells that the first Christian preachers were Marcion and Basilides, and only later did so-called Catholic Christianity come in with a bishop named Palute. And since the word Christian was already taken, his faction was called the Paulicians, and that's pretty interesting. So there were not only just as many Marcionites, but they were the first on the ground in some places.
And what were some of the habits or beliefs in Marcionites? I think you mentioned a couple. Was it vegetarianism, asceticism, no marriage, anything else?
Yeah, he said if you are marrying, you're begetting children, and look what you're doing. You're just giving more hostages to the Creator. However, if you are married when you convert, don't get divorced. I'm not sure why he thought that, but actually I think Marcion, since he actually had organized churches, he already represents what Casamon calls nascent Catholicism, strangely enough. To have an organized church rather than a subversive don't ask, don't tell group within a congregation like the Gnostics did means that you've got to have some kind of family ethic. Stephen Davies, in his great little book, The Revolt of the Widows, the Social World of the Apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, he talks about these itinerant radical preachers to whom we owe all these sayings about giving up your livelihood, your home, your relatives, and following Jesus. These people had groups probably like the Q community, who were groups of sympathizers, something like the schools of the sons of the prophets, between which Elijah and Elisha would circulate, or the disciples of Isaiah that he mentions. Well, these people went around and were fed and did miracles or whatever and preached, and they're mentioned in the Didache and all that. Apostles that wander in and let them conduct the service, but don't let them stay too long, because that way you might have moochers on your hands. Well, these people preached to communities of followers, but as time went on, they had less and less to say to them, because second and third generation Christians brought up families. They hadn't anticipated this. They thought the world was going to end. And so all sexual distinctions were irrelevant. There was no point in getting married. But as time went by, history continued, as all sects do. I think Weber said they re-assimilated to broader social norms. And so the only ones that the itinerants, who probably included Gnostics, the only ones they could get a hearing from were fellow marginalized Christians like monks and nuns and widows. And they were beginning to get depowered by the bishops and so on. And so the charismatic authority of the itinerants pretty much vanished. There would always be a few of them, like Simeon Stylites and others, but and I think Marcion, who has a double ethic for families in his church, already had to retreat from pure radicalism. And so he's already beginning the Catholicizing process, strangely enough. But I guess that shouldn't be too much of a surprise, since he just wanted to say Jesus started something other than Judaism. He wasn't necessarily trying to say the world was going to end.
So it's safe to assume that Adolf von Harnack was the one who opened the door to understanding Marcion.
Yeah, he has this great statement. In the early church, the only one who understood Paul was Marcion, and even he misunderstood him. I'm not so sure about the last part.
Right.
Of course, Harnack he was a conservative in many ways, and he rejected the Tübingen school, big mistake. So he early dated Pauline epistles and Acts and so on. So he thought there was a first century Paulinism, and he's taking documents that represent kind of mulligan stew Paulinism with Gnostic, Marcionite, Catholic, and who knows what all elements, taking that for the real Paul, and then seeing how Marcion seems to get the real genius of it, but of course he doesn't sound Catholic, so he drives a wedge that there really shouldn't be. But Harnack was the one who really began to appreciate him as a reformer.
Yeah, didn't he say he was a precursor to Luther?
Yes, and he was in so many ways. And though I think, unlike Luther, he wasn't an anti-Semite. I think Hoffman has shown that in fact had his view prevailed, history might have been a whole lot different, because he had nothing against Judaism. He just said it's a different religion. And we don't want to steal their scriptures and pretend they talk about our religion. Boy, oh boy, if Christians had always taken that view, would you have had this, what René Girard calls mimetic rivalry? Would you have had this Christian agenda that says, gee, I kind of like that chosen people stuff. You know, we're the chosen people, not you. Your scriptures are ours, not yours, which, like Justin Martyr baldly says. Well, to read your scriptures, though, really, come to think of it, they're not your scriptures, they're our scriptures. He actually says this. Like, if we'd had Marcion regnant, I don't know if we'd have had any of that nonsense.
Yeah, it could have saved us a lot of bloodshed.
Yeah.
For sure. Was it Harnack who I've heard he created like a Marcion revival that like Franz Kafka and Adler were part of it? Have you heard of this?
No, that's interesting. I've never heard of that.
Oh,
Not
okay.
that I would have. I mean, I'm sure you're right.
Yes.
Fascinating. I'll have to look into that. How were they Neo-Marcionites?
Yeah, they hung out in Prague where there was a revival. If you get Stefan Heller's Gnosticism, a new light, and an ancient tradition. He talks about that.
Wow.
So, yeah, very well, especially if you read Kafka. It's not hard. That's not a stretch.
Fascinating.
Uh-huh. And last question, well, besides the revival, how long did the Marcionite churches last before they were finally put to rest?
I could be mixing this up with Manichaeanism, but I believe it may have lasted for something like until 800, beyond the bounds of the Roman Empire. I'd really need to look that up, though. The Manichaean religion lived as a world religion for 1,000 years. This didn't have that much luck, but it did last for some centuries.
But were Marcionites missionary like the Manichaeans?
I guess they must have been, because it just caught on all over the empire, seemingly overnight. And I guess, they must have been, because they, I guess their headquarters was in Asia Minor, and they must have gone across the Euphrates and into these other countries.
And lastly, which I have to ask you, and I'm waiting, when are you going to come out with your book on Paul? So
I'm actively working on it now, The Amazing Colossal Apostle. Yeah, I'm really having great fun and clarifying a lot of things in my own mind, and most of it is written, actually. But I'm really zeroing in on the heart of the argument with the relation between the historical Paul and Simon Magus, and then dissecting the epistles into their different layers by their theological viewpoints, and trying to catch up reading some of the radical critics of the past, seeing how far they beat me to it in places where I have to disagree with them. So I'm having a great time, and I hope I'll be able to be done with it in a few months.
Must be like writing a detective novel, right?
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and I'm learning a lot. I suddenly realized again and again, if this is true, here's where so-and-so oddball piece of data would finally fit in. So whenever you have these weird little things here and there, and somebody proposes a paradigm that would make sense to them, aha, click! And I'm beginning to have a number of those aha moments. So I think it'll be a really fascinating thing. I want to work with my daughter to do a cover design with one of these old engravings of Paul, and have him looming gigantically over a cityscape, only the buildings will all be churches, and maybe he'll have a bishop or two in his hands. Because, of course, the whole thing's The Amazing Colossal Apostle is based on a cheesy sci-fi flick title, The Amazing Colossal Man.
Right. Well, we can't wait for that book to come out. I can't wait so we can finally get, like I said, with Marcion and Paul and all that, adding the dots is hard, but it's a fascinating time. That's
yeah. Mm-hmm. Also, something to celebrate is that Joe Hoffman is working on a revised version of his terrific book, Marcion on the Restoration of Christianity. That is just a heck of a book. It came out in 1984 from Scholars Press, and he's come up with a little more interesting material.
All right, Bob. Well, I think that should do it. And as always, it's a pleasure having you. And thanks for taking your time to come on Coffee, Nails, and Gnosis.
Great to talk with you.
All right. Well, we'll talk to you soon. And you have yourself a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Take care. And there you have it, my beloved truth seekers. Robert Price, author of Deconstructing Jesus, the Incredibly Shrinking Son of Man, and the Pre-Nicene Bible, showering us with a complete dose of Marcion and the Marcionites. Kinda sounds like a cool name for a 60s band, Marcion and the Marcionites. It is arguable that all roads of Christianity led through Marcion, but it's certainly true that it had been better if all roads leading out of Christianity had come from Marcion. Imagine a church that believed in nonviolence, voluntary asceticism, and an inward struggle to a higher reality instead of a sleight-of-hand conversion mentality. Beyond all the pagans, Gnostics, and rivaling Christianities that were brutally aborted from history, imagine all the millions of Jews in history that would have been spared, because the reality is that Christianity has always seen Judaism as a nagging splinter on its side. I've heard many fundagelical theologians claim that the Gnostics were anti-Semite, but our show today proves that it was quite the opposite. Marcion simply wanted to live and let live. Believe in what is mine, and what is yours, and let's all get along under our own gods. Furthermore, and ultimately, the Gnostics started as Jews, so their arguments fall flat like most polemics of orthodoxy. One would be hard-pressed to find a more inclusive, peaceful, and acceptant ideology as that of Gnosticism. Unlike all other religions in the whole world, there has never been a war or violent explosion caused in the name of Gnosticism. You can take that to the metaphysical bank. We are the Gnostics. We are writing our own gospels and living our own myths. Divided we stand, together we rise. I am Abraxas, broadcasting from the virtual Alexandria. The road is ended, the song is over, thought I'd have something more to say. But don't cultivate any troubles, my beloved truth seekers, because like heaven above you, the spy that loves